Before we can start to have a conversation about anti-Zionism, there's a need to clearly define what we often mean when we say the word Zionism. And I would like to go with the definition given by Kwame Ture from an interview he did with the AARP, that is the All African People's Revolutionary Party, in 1996.
You also mentioned Zionism and said that some of our young people in the Persian Gulf may not understand the role that Zionism is playing in this conflict. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Unfortunately, they don't know what Zionism is, but Zionism is a political philosophy which has brought about the state of Israel, the so-called state of Israel. This political philosophy has nothing to do with religion. On the contrary, it seeks to confuse others and let them think that Zionism and Judaism is one and the same. I am a conscious African. I know properly my history. I know that Africa gave Judaism to the world. I know that the first Jews in the world were Africans. Not only do I know this, but I inform everyone who has doubts about it to read a book by Sigmund Freud entitled Moses and Monotheism as a beginning. Consequently, I know that Judaism and Zionism are not the same. Zionism had its first organizational expressions in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland, in Europe. Here was a man by the name of Theodore Herzl, H-E-R-Z-L. He was the founder of Zionism. He said that he was going to find the state that God promised the Jews. Listen to this very carefully. This man, Herzl, was an atheist. He believed that there was no God. He said God did not exist. Now, how is it that a man who believes that God does not exist is going to find a state that God promised to his chosen people? I'm telling you, this man is Satan in disguise. Zionism is a satanic movement. It is devil. It is imperialism. It is racist. It has gone and taken the lands of the Palestinian people and through terrorism has driven them out. And through terrorism, it maintains its power. And the United States of America, with over 6 million homeless, sends to Israel billions and billions and billions of dollars everywhere to bomb Palestinian people while homeless people are here and unemployed are here. Zionism is going to raise this war and make the people in America become clear to what it is and become anti-Zionist and stop the aid to Israel and use the money to take care of the homeless in this country.
With that definition in mind, anti-Zionism, therefore, is the movement that resists the political philosophy that drives the action of occupying the land and erasing the heritage and the peoples of Palestine currently being executed by the settler state of Israel. Now, before I go into the book recommendations, if you're about to come into my comments typing up a storm about how being anti-Zionist is being anti-Semitic, just hold it right there. They aren't the same. You know it and I know it. It's all a straw man argument to get people running around in circles instead of focusing on what Zionism has been doing publicly to serve Israel's interest in its occupation of Palestinian lands. And if you need further confirmation about how anti-Zionism isn't and shouldn't be conflated with anti-Semitism, I would like to direct you to the argument made by Anthony Lerman, the former director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, who mentioned in his book, Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism, Redefinition and the Myth of the Collective Jew, the anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism argument drains the word anti-Semitism of any useful meaning, for it means that to count as an anti-Semite, it is sufficient to hold any view ranging from criticism of the policies of the current Israeli government to denial that Israel has the right to exist as a state without having to subscribe to any of those things which historians have traditionally regarded as making up an anti-Semitic worldview. Hatred of Jews per se, belief that Jews are racially inferior, and so on. Moreover, while theoretically allowing that criticism of Israeli government is legitimate, in practice it virtually proscribes any such thing. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. So now that we have that out of the way, let's move on to the recommendation part of this video. Here are 20 books that challenge Zionism that you should have on your list at some point in your life. And as I always do for my recommendation list for the Fuckathon, which for those who do not know what that is, the Fuckathon is a month-long readathon that I created and I host every year, where we use books to learn more about pertinent issues we are facing in the world so we can arm ourselves with the knowledge of the why and the how, which then compels us even further to take actions. So like I always do with my recommendations, this would be a mix of non-fiction work, which are quite dense reading materials, and fictional work. There's YA, there are children's books for those who want to start having these necessary conversations with their kids early on. Or maybe that's just the genre of books they enjoy reading, which is fine as well. There are satirical comics, love stories. I try to have quite the well-rounded list. As such, we'll start with Theodore Herzl by Jacques Kohnberg. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the interview clip I'd shared at the start of this video from Kwame Ture, where he does mention Theodore Herzl being an atheist who, seeing the political benefits of aligning with his Jewish heritage, decides to do so because it is expedient for him. Herzl is the modern day originator of Zionism as the political movement that it is today. Jack Schoenberg's book is a biographical account born out of quite rigorous research made up of documents, letters and diaries that help us to unravel the mystery behind the man and all he stood for. Now, why do I think challenging Zionism should start by having an unbiased understanding of the person who originated it in its present form? It's simple. Because it opens our eyes to the why, the reason behind it. Because if the source of a political movement is flawed and self-serving, then that means that the very foundation upon which it is built had cracks from the start. If it's a movement born out of a selfish need that would benefit a certain person, then of course it would evolve into benefiting a system of government that grasps for power and is built on blood, lies and brutalization. And so in his book, Schoenberg sets out to understand the psychology of Herzl, what drove and motivated him. We get a complete grasp of the man, his motivations and political leanings, all set within the historical context of the times and his life. The next book on the list is a comic collection of satirical work that aims to confront Zionism and the role America plays in upholding it for the country's own needs and desires. I'm of course talking about Diaspora Boy, Comics on Crisis in America and Israel by Eli Valley. Now, if you're a fan of comics, especially the type that is cartoonish, satirical, and based off of caricatures, then this is the collection for you. Eli Valley's art is like a fever dream. It is outrageous, it is cutting with this slapstick edge, all aimed at revealing the hypocrisy inherent in the relationship between America and Israel. And like I stated earlier, how this partnership benefits both countries and fuels the genocide that has been ongoing for over 75 years. Because like a lot of people have been saying, this didn't start in October 7th. Valley's collection was released 7 years ago, and his comic strips have always been derided by Zionists as being vile. They've referred to him as a self-hating Jew. They have decried his work and portrayal, and yes, some of those art are very controversial. If it had been anyone else but Valley drawing them, I would have raised a couple of eyebrows. But the significance of work like Diaspora Boy is to show how actively the Jewish diaspora are also fighting Zionism and showing it off for the blood-fueled land grab that it is at its political core, and how no matter how much American evangelists and the American government that is served by upholding Israel's invalid claims are benefiting from it, try to spin it any other way, we have actual Jewish people shutting it down. So if you would like a collection of comics that tell uncomfortable truths, that is brimming with creativity and includes short notes to accompany each piece, because Eli recognizes that people need context to fully appreciate and understand the message contained in the art, then you should consider Diaspora Boy, Comics on Crisis in America and Israel by Eli Valley. From one man who has been decried as a self-hating Jew to another who has been called the very same term, whose life story spans what it looks like to have a grandfather who went from being anti-fascist to becoming a militant Zionist as a result of life experiences, whilst he himself, the grandchild that is an anti-Zionist. We have If I Am Not For Myself, Journey of an Anti-Zionist Jew by Mike McCuskey. If I Am Not For Myself addresses what it means to live in a world where being Jewish seems to be equated with a loyalty to the state of Israel, and the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, a false narrative that doesn't serve anyone but Israel, who has positioned any criticism of the brutal and violent structures as being hateful to everyone of Jewish faith. And that is why books like If I Am Not For Myself and Diaspora Boy are important, because it shows Jewish people actively involved in this struggle, denouncing the supremacist undertaking of the Israeli state and its atrocities, refusing to let the settler colony state use them and their cause to further its genocidal campaigns. As Mike McCuskey writes, I find in anti-Zionism emancipation both as a Jew and as a human being. The problem today isn't that Jews are in denial of their Jewishness or of the threat of anti-Semitism, but that Jews are in denial about Israel, Zionism, the Nakba, the occupation, the wall. The people who call us self-haters want to steal ourselves from us, appropriate ourselves for their cause. And speaking as a self, I am damned if I'm going to let them get away with it. Still speaking on Jewish opposition, that is the very next title on the list. A Threat from Within, a century of Jewish opposition to Zionism by Yaakov M. Rapkin, which seeks to challenge the belief and misrepresentation that Jewish folk opposing Zionism is a new thing that's feeding into the threat of anti-Semitism. It isn't. Yaakov, with this book, clearly details details over a century of Jewish people, particularly Jewish spiritual leaders of Judaism, opposing Zionism and being very vocal about their oppositions. And even with how Israel keeps growing in force and military might and power, and keeps maintaining the relationships and approvals from Western countries like America and Britain, where colonialist interests are aligned with Israel, we have these dissenting voices that haven't dwindled in the past century, and in fact have grown in numbers and in the loudness of their objections with the atrocities that Israel keeps committing in the names of Jewish people and Judaism. Yaakov's scholarship, as contained in this book, proves that it is not just one solitary Jewish voice that is rising in opposition to this, but a group, a substantial group of Jewish folks. And I'm sure a lot of us have seen them at protests, have seen them being vocal about their objections to Zionism. Because just like Mark Makisi stated in his book, there has to be a very clear refusal to let Israel use Jewish people as a smokescreen to validate their stance of bloodshed and genocide. But these conversations cannot only focus on Jewish people and Jewish voices. We also need to center Palestinians who are being displaced, whose lands are being stolen, whose bodies are being brutalized, and whose people are being martyred, especially young Palestinians who are growing up within the occupied territories, which is why the fourth book on this list is Young Palestinians Speak, Living Under Occupation by Anne-Marie Young and Anthony Robinson Jr. It is a book that provides a platform for young Palestinians to share their hopes, their dreams, and their fears. It is a brutal but honest look at what it means to be a young person living in occupied Palestine, with photographs, artworks, maps, and writing from these kids, because that is what they are. What our world likes to pretend that they aren't: kids. And using their voices and their stories, we get an overview of the occupation and a deeper understanding of the region, with an exploration of the geographic makeup and history of each location. We visit 9 Palestinian cities and villages, from Ramallah to Burj Al Lukluk. The sit-down locations where these conversations happen take the range from schools to community centers to libraries to their own homes, where the writers visited them to document these experiences. Some of these locations are not standing anymore. Some of these kids aren't here anymore. Let that sink in. Consider what it means that some of these voices who had shared their hopes and dreams have most likely been martyred by Israeli forces since the book was released. Some of them in the most recent bombardment of Gaza and Rafah. It is a devastating realization that hits me multiple times, every single day. May the souls and spirits of those gone find rest, and may those who still walk this earth live long enough to finally see their homeland liberated so they can come home. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I know when we say that, a lot of people wonder how. They question what it would look like, and in response, I point us to Edward Said's The Question of Palestine, which is the 5th book on this list. When people talk often of Zionism, we address it as a political entity, but we rarely consider what legacy it upholds, its far-reaching consequences. In The Question of Palestine, Edward Said, in trying to give us a deeper grasp into the depths of support that Zionism received from thinkers and writers of the latter part of the 19th century and the why of it, suggests that cultures that accepted the views of Orientalists often saw themselves as inherently superior to the natives of these locations, who are often portrayed as being inferior and in need of civilization. And so Orientalists saw Zionism and portrayed it as this liberating and liberalizing colonial movement that is bringing this civilization to these primitive areas and location. It is disgusting, and once again, Arthur Balfour, I hope you continue to fucking rot. But back to Said and the occupation of Palestine, he also expresses where the friction begins between Jewish interests as Zionism starts to transform from being a secular colonial movement to one that started to appeal to religious Jews, which was starting to contradict the promise of civilization and liberal values upon which Zionism was initially founded. What Edward Said gives us is cold hard facts to back up his arguments, to make readers and the whole world at large question the Israeli project, its historical refusal to live peacefully with the Palestinian people, and its failure to manage its statehood without violent colonialist and repressive practices, with that dash of racism, some sprinkle. Because how else do you justify those atrocities without othering those whose identity and heritage back their claims to the land you were given? Once again, fuck Arthur Balfour. But away from that odious man and to the next book on my list, which is a children's book, Birthday Kunafa by Raif Ebaid, illustrated by Noor Ashalabi. Birthday Kunafa follows Amal, who all she wants for her birthday, and you know how it is, when your birthday is around and you have a craving and there's a particular meal or sweet that you absolutely must have because it's your day and you deserve that celebration and care. Well, Amal wants the sweetest slice of cheesy kunafa from Nablus Sweets, which she believes is the absolute best place in town. And when her birthday party is over and she still hasn't caught a sight of her beloved tasty kunafa, Amal sets up a plan to go get it herself so she can have a birthday desire met. It is sweet, it is adorable, it is heartbreaking. Because when you consider the why and you realize the obstacles that are in Amal's way as you flip through the pages, it hits you. It's the occupation. She would have to find her way from her home in Jerusalem to Nablus, where the kunafa is, and standing in the way are Israeli forces who enforce stringent measures that limit the ease with which Palestinians, especially a young girl like Amal, can move within the country of her birth. And yet, because it's her birthday, we see moments, pockets of joy throughout the pages. It's a tour of Palestine, a reminder of the freedoms we take for granted, and an affirmation for why we fight and push for a free Palestine. It's a beautiful book, just 50 pages with no words at all, just illustration. Kids will love it, adults will love it too. From a fairly heartwarming children's story that leaves us with a lot to think about, to another children's story that leaves us with a lot to think about, but this one, not so heartwarming. We have Tasting the Sky, a Palestinian childhood by Ibtisam Barakat. Unlike Birthday Kunafa, which is a picture book, Tasting the Sky is a memoir that is set in Ramallah in the aftermath of the 1967 Six-Day War. I've stated earlier in this video the importance of listening to young people, young voices tell us what their experiences are living in occupied territories. But with this memoir, Ibtisam paints a vivid, utterly crushing account of what it is to be a child living underneath a sky filled with the echoes and flashes and bursts of war that eventually, when it died down, saw the last of Palestinian lands and peoples firmly underneath the control of Israel. Her story covers what happens from age 4 to when she's 7, and what we see is a perspective into what war does for a child, how a child will try to interpret it, will try to understand that level of devastation, even amongst the rebuilding that the adults in said child's life have to do. It is really truly a heartbreaking book, made even more so because it would inevitably have you comparing your childhood, your experiences at ages 4 to 7, and see just how markedly different your life was compared to other children just like you were, who were living in occupied territories then and now. Next up is Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society by Nadia Abu El-Haj, which is a book born out of her doctoral thesis at Duke University. To understand why I have Facts on the Ground on the list, I need to offer you a context on the controversy that was born out of this book. Because yes, when this book was released back in 2001, there was quite the uproar, because Nadia explored how Israeli archaeology used the study and science as a way to form and then deeply entrench its colonial national historical imagination on Palestinian lands in order to give any form of validity to their land grab. Nadia studied just how science can be further exploited to serve the interests of a settler colonist entity like Israel, to convince people that they have some connection to the lands and so are deserving of the Israeli government and forces forcefully taking this land, thus trying to legitimize the Israeli state and occupying forces, giving it a history that isn't really it. Like I said, the book, when it came out in 2001, generated a ton of conversations from all sides. But then things wrapped up even further when pro-Zionist groups got the news in 2006 that Nadia Abu El-Haj was under consideration for tenure at Barnard College, where prior to that she had been serving as an assistant professor. They started a campaign aimed at pressuring Barnard College to fire her and not even consider granting her tenure. The campaign was spearheaded by a Jewish woman who was a Barnard College graduate and alumni living in the occupied Palestinian territories. Like, it burst my brain. The audacity. Thankfully, the campaign didn't succeed and Nadia was not fired and she was given tenure. But the reaction just goes to show how important Facts on the Ground is. If you're someone who loves archaeology, which is a great time for me to chime in that when I was younger, I wanted to be an archaeologist so badly. I blame watching The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. Like, sure, that movie turned me bi, and I was not sure if I wanted to be with Evie or Rick Imhotep or Anok-Sunumu or Adeth Bey. But it also made me want to be an archaeologist so bad. It and Indiana Jones. But not the stealing sacred items like Jones was doing, because that was theft and someone's ancestors should have fried his ass. But in the excavating of the past, in observing and honoring the lives and existence of those who came before us, to get a glimpse of how they lived, what they loved and enjoyed, who they loved, what systems and structures guided their lives and how they experienced it, what histories they contained. Archaeology was and is still beautiful to me. And if you're someone who is fascinated by it, then this might be the book for you. Because like I said, Nadia brings an added layer to how Zionism has further shifted narratives and is trying to rewrite history, and some would say has rewritten parts of history to fit its narratives, all to give itself legitimacy. And it's done so through science, through scholarship. And so part of working to resist that, to resist a false narrative being pushed and planted, is through science, through scholarship. And that's what Nadia Abu El Haj does with her book. So pick it up for that. Pick it up also out of spite for the people who thought they would ruin her and her career for doing the research and speaking the truth, and who failed in their witch hunts. From an archaeological study, we move to Ramzi Baroud's memoir, My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, Gaza's Untold Story, which chronicles, yes, I just said chronicles on my Chronicles of Noria channel. It is poetic in a way. Ramzi Baroud chronicles the daily lives of people living at the front line, what it means to exist underneath a sky and on a land that is constantly barraged with never-ending rounds of violence by an occupying force. A lot of time when we speak of Palestinian resistance fighters, we do so with this detachment. They are numbers wearing masks, fighting for the freedom of an oppressed people. Ramzi Baroud aims to change that by telling us his father's story, who, after he was driven out of his village to a refugee camp, because displacement is what happens when occupying forces move to your ancestral village on Beit Daras. And so Ramzi's father took up arms to add his strength in resisting the occupation, whilst at the same time trying to raise his children and do the best he can for them. This memoir aims to show the Palestinian resistance fighters as people, nuanced, complex people who are doing the best they can in fighting for the freedom of their people. They are mothers and fathers, amazing brothers and sisters, lovers with a sense of humor, grandfathers with histories that stretch back to the Ottoman Empire. They aren't numbers. They are regular people like you and I who have witnessed the horrors and brutalities that their people have experienced and have had enough. And they too deserve to have their story told. Just like Ramzi Baroud explores the lives of his father and grandfathers prior to the displacement, the 11th book on the list, Mother of Strangers by Suad Amiri, does the same. Except this book paints a picture of Jafar before the bombardment of the city starts in 1948. Jafar with his thriving orange export business, with its open borders that welcomed everyone, Muslim, Jews and Christians, who all lived together peacefully. Jafar pre-1948, that was referred to as the Mother of Strangers, is shown to us in all its beauty and serenity and harmony, with the laughter and the smells and the voices of kids playing, the elders wanting to give the kids new experiences, tradesmen plying their trade, all through the eyes of Subhi, a 15-year-old mechanic who hopes to one day marry his crush Shams, a 13-year-old student. It's what makes it all especially painful when the bombardment starts. Suad Amiri takes the time to make us fall in love with Jafar, so that when the city is utterly decimated and destroyed, which is just as representative of the brutalization that Palestine as a whole experienced and still does, then the pain of that loss hits us even harder. It is a beautiful, stunning, heartbreaking book, as is a lot of the books on this list, if we're being honest. Like, for example, Trees for the Absentees by Halam Bashrat, translated by Ruth Ahmedzai Kemp and Sue Copeland, which tells us a magical realism coming-of-age story of Philistia, a university student who grew up with her grandmother Saïa, who worked as a midwife and a corpse washer, teaching Philistia about the history and significance of ritual ablutions and the secret about life and death. With her grandmother now dead, however, and her father detained in prison, Philistia now works in a hammam, which are kind of spas or bathhouses in Nablus, washing women's bodies as a part-time gig. As she works, she grieves the loss of her grandmother, remembering the lessons she's taught her, and in her grief, her mind takes her on a journey of centuries of occupation, how it has devastated the lands, with a particular attention paid to the Israeli occupation's burning of the Palestinian olive groves. It is a short book that is moving, and heartbreaking and beautiful, and would be particularly striking if you're someone who has lost family members who were instrumental in keeping you connected to your past and your ancestry. But from a tour of Palestine that is riddled with pain to one that has a more celebratory tone, I am of course referring to the children's book We Are Palestinian by Reem Kassis, illustrated by Noah Eluti, which is a book filled with the most beautiful imagery, the most wonderful stories, the most fascinating facts about Palestine, and quotes that will stick with you long after you've dropped it. You get to understand not just the culture but also the history behind things like the Palestinian folk dance, the dabke, Palestinian embroidery like tatrees, mouth-watering dishes like nafe, and the inspiring poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. You get a glimpse of Palestinians through the eyes of people who love the country, who love their heritage, who love their people. It is lush, it is beautiful, it is colorful, it is stunning, it is inspiring, it is celebratory, it is perfect, and should totally be on your list of books by Palestinian writers and artists that you should consider getting. Another book that you could add to your list is My First and Only Love by Sahar Khalife, translated by Aida Bamia. It is a love story to Palestine, a love story to the resistance fighters who have been fighting for Palestinian freedom since the 1948 Nakba, a love story to a specific resistance fighter, and a love story to family histories long forgotten and a national past that is just waiting to be discovered. In My First and Only Love, we follow Nidal, who returns home to Nablus decades after the 1948 Nakba had basically forced her into exile. She left Nablus a young girl who was starting to fall for Rabi, a resistance fighter, and when she returns, she is reunited with Rabi, who in turn encourages her to reconnect with her family, particularly her uncle, who she gets to know better through his memoirs, and her mother, who factors in said memoir. It is beautiful, and if you're someone who loves the heartbreak of a good love story that traces our connection to our roots, to national pride, and to matters of the heart, then maybe My First and Only Love by Sahar Khalife should be on your list. If, however, you are less interested in reading something romantic and heartbreaking in equal measure, and instead would prefer a book that addresses not America this time around, but the role that the European Union has played in furthering the occupation of Palestinian lands by the Israeli state, then consider David Cronin's Europe's Alliance with Israel, Aiding the Occupation, where David, in his journalistic capacity, interrogates the relationship between the European Union and Israel, and how it is not just the United States that has been very accommodating over the years of Israel's atrocities, but the EU has as well, and has created such a system of cooperation and support in a way that Israel at this point is practically a member of the Union. And this partnership is in turn weaponized by the Israeli government and forces to legitimize their continued brutalization of Palestinian lands and peoples, because if a superpower like America isn't doing anything to keep them in check, and the European Union is supporting them as well and not urging caution or restraints, then the Israeli government can continue and has been continuing its horrific actions, and no one has stepped in, especially not with the European Union being influenced to keep its alignment with Israeli interests. It is a well-researched and documented book. Even more so when the survivors return to a land that has been claimed by another people who are trying to turn a forced exile into an opportunity to dominate and seek roots into a land that isn't theirs and was never theirs. In my previous Fuck Colonialism video, I had dropped a Susan Abulawa recommendation, Mornings in Jenin, which is just beautiful. And Susan once again comes through with Against the Loveless World, the next book on the list. Against the Loveless World can read like it's a piece of non-fiction with how real and connected it is with Palestinian experiences, but that just goes to confirm the authentic way and voice that Susan Abulawa used in gifting us the story that follows Nar, who is currently sitting in solitary confinement in the Cube, a famous Israeli prison in a country that she barely knows or recognizes, as she takes us through all the twists and turns her life has taken. And God's, Ner has been through it. She was born in Kuwait in the 70s to Palestinian refugees, and the man she thought loves her as much as she loved him abandons her after a brief marriage to her, and with her parents on the brink of poverty, she turns to sex work, with the US invasion of Iraq making her a refugee like her parents had been. And after a brief stint in Jordan, she finds her way to Palestine, where she finally makes a home for herself, falls in love, and then in the future finds herself imprisoned in solitary confinement in the Cube. The how did she get to where she currently is at? It's something Against the Loveless World explores in a way that would have your heart breaking for Nar, even as you root for her. It is a beautiful, stunning book, but heartbreaking. And also do look out for the trigger warnings, because some of our experiences, especially the sexual assault, can be pretty triggering to some people. Book 18 on the list, and gods, this is a long list, is yet another book by Alam Basharat titled Codename Butterfly, translated by Nancy Roberts. If you just thought to yourself, why does that author name sound so familiar? That's because she wrote Trees for the Absentees, which was number 12 on the list. And whilst Philistia is a university undergrad, our lead character, codenamed Butterfly, is a young girl coming into adulthood. She's smart, she's clever, she's perceptive, she's feeling all the emotions that teenage girls our age do. That is, she has a crush on a boy who she's hoping will give her a sign, confirmation that he likes her back. She's trying to maintain her friendships between two girls drawn on different sides, and all the while she has questions that concern her. Questions like, is her father a collaborator with the occupiers, for example? Because you see, Butterfly is living in occupied Palestine, and through her eyes we see a young girl who just wants to have a normal teenage experience, and so she bottles and scribbles down her worries and her concerns, and we never really get to know her name, because she's Butterfly until the very end. Beautiful, fleeting, precious, fragile. She's representative of the childhood, the girlhood, the coming to age and experiencing puberty and all it brings that young people in Palestine are experiencing. The moments of normalcy and peace that they carve in the midst of their lives. The questions that they hold and lock in imaginary boxes as some of them come into adulthood and some are martyred while still kids. Now, from one young adult novel to another, the next book on the list is Where the Streets Had a Name by Randa Abdel Fattah. That follows 13-year-old Ayat, a Muslim Palestinian girl living in Bethlehem with her family, whose life is changed when her and her best friend are caught in a bomb blast, which, spoiler alert, kills her best friend and scars Ayat's face permanently. Living in Bethlehem with her are her mother, her brothers, her sister who is planning her wedding, her grandmother who fills her days telling Ayat stories about her past, and her father who is grieving the loss of his olive groves as they were displaced, ends them living in Bethlehem at the start of the story. We see an exploration of the mundane interfaced with the casual horrors of what it means to live in the occupied territory of Palestine. And when her grandmother falls ill, very ill, Ayat decides to travel to Jerusalem to fulfill her grandmother's wish to touch the soil of her ancestral home before she passes. And so Ayat heads to Jerusalem with her now best friend Sami, a Christian Palestinian girl who loves reality TV shows and football. And together they undertake the 6-mile journey that would take them from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, going through checkpoints and roadblocks that paint a very vivid picture of how the Israeli occupation forces severely limit the movement of Palestinians on their own home and on their soil. All with Ayat's hope that getting Jerusalem's soil for her grandmother to touch would help heal her grandmother. It is a journey that shows us both the realities of what it means to live in the occupied territories, but also shows us the actual Palestinian people, travelers and peace activists and refugees. Their experiences interwoven with Ayat tell a cohesive and very honest story. What gets me even more about Where the Streets Had a Name is the fact that Randa Abdel Fattah lost her own grandmother just before her book was published. She wrote this as her dedication. To my grandmother, Siti Jamila, who passed away on 24th April 2008, aged 98. I had hoped that you will live to see this book and that you will be allowed to touch the soil of your homeland again. It is my consolation that you died surrounded by my father and family and friends who cherished you. May you rest in peace. And to my father, may you see a free Palestine in your lifetime. And finally, the last book on this recommendation list, Captive Revolution, Palestinian Women's Anti-Colonial Struggles Within the Israeli Prison System by Nala Abdo, who visited Israeli prisons and spoke to the women who have been detained for their political activism and resistance. Often when we think of resistance fighters, especially Palestinian ones, the faces that automatically come to our minds are often men or male presenting people. Women, though, are often left out of this conversation, which Nala Abdul considers a travesty because resistance fighters have always been a mix. Everyone plays a role in liberation because when a colonized and heavily brutalized people are free, everyone is free, regardless of gender. And so with Nala's book, we consider those often forgotten or ignored in this fight. We hear their stories from them. We sit in council with the words and the histories they have to share. We acknowledge the sexist racism that keeps them out of the resistance-driven conversation, and it forces us to think on our own histories and the women that fought for our liberation and the stories that were told or not told about them, and how it is our collective responsibility to not forget them, no matter how desperately the system would rather have them ignored and their contributions erased. Wow. You made it to the end of the longest recommendation video I have ever put together. This took hours, days, weeks of work. I hope it serves as a great launchpad for you to read and learn even more, so you can be as justifiably pissed, even more so, and respond with us as we say fuck Zionism. Also, do share this video so others can check out the list. It might serve them well as well. Oh, and take the moment to like this video if it was in any way helpful. If you're interested in the Fuckathon Readathon, then do check out my announcement videos for the prompts. I will leave the link in the description bar for you. We kick off on July 1st. My next recommendation video for the prompt is Fuck the Police. So you know that that's going to be a doozy. So come check it out next Friday at 5 p.m. EST. If you like anime or manga content, however, those videos drop on Mondays. If you would like to hear my thoughts on movies and shows, at the moment I am in full Bridgerton brain mode. Those videos drop on Wednesdays. So that's 3 videos a week. All of them will drop at 5 p.m. EST. Thank you to everyone who watches my content, who comments and responds. A huge thank you to my patrons as well. You all keep me going and help sustain me. Until my next video, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.